17 years and this is where we are.
We can work through this.
Work through what? Another month of you sending out resumes? Another month of me covering everything? Tessa gave you more time than you deserved.
Is this really what you want?
I already called the lawyer. The house stays with me.
Then I'll go.
You don't bring anything into this house anymore.
She said it without hesitating. 9 words, the way someone closes a door on a room they have no intention of entering again. She had decided I was finished, not just in this marriage, but as a man worth anything at all. Judith stood behind her like a verdict already signed. I picked up the suitcase and walked out. Quietly, steadily, without looking back. And when a man leaves that way, it usually means he knows something the people watching him don't. What did Tessa think she was getting rid of, and what was she actually walking away from? If you've ever felt like someone wrote you off before they ever really saw you, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. The night Tessa told me to leave, I had spent the previous 6 hours sitting in a parking lot outside a downtown office building, watching other men in pressed shirts walk in and out of glass doors like they owned the air they breathed. I had gone there for an interview, a regional operations role at a logistics firm, a step down from what I had spent nearly 2 decades building, but something I was willing to take because something was better than nothing. They called 3 days later to say they had decided to go in a different direction. I already knew what that meant before the sentence finished. I want to be honest about how things were before that night, because if I skip over it, none of what came after would make any sense. Tessa and I had been married for 17 years. We had built something together, not glamorous, not effortless, but real. The early years were lean. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Raleigh, split grocery bills, and took turns being optimistic when one of us started to lose traction. I worked my way up through operations management. She built a brand consulting practice from client referrals and sheer determination. We were not wealthy, but we were on our way, and that felt like enough. The trouble was that on our way eventually became already arrived in Tessa's mind, and once that happened, the destination kept moving. The house in North Briar Estates came first, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a backyard that looked better in the listing photos than in real life. Then came the dinner parties, the charity galas, the careful curation of which neighbors they invited in and which ones they waved at from a distance. Tessa was not a cruel woman. I need to say that clearly. But she was a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that status was not just a comfort, it was proof. Proof that she had made the right choices. Proof that she was not her mother's daughter in the ways that she feared most. That last part is something I understood intellectually, but never fully grasped until it was too late. Judith Langdon had grown up without much, married a man who had even less, and spent the rest of her life making her peace with that in ways that left permanent marks on how she raised her daughter. She pushed Tessa from the time Tessa was old enough to listen, not with cruelty, but with something quieter and more persistent than cruelty. She would say things at Sunday dinners, things with the texture of observations rather than criticisms. Things like, "You have so much more potential than this neighborhood can hold." Things like, "A woman like you deserves a man who can match her." She said those things in front of me with the mild expression of someone commenting on the weather, and Tessa would change the subject and I would pretend I had not heard. For years, I told myself it was harmless. Tessa's own choices were what mattered, and she had chosen me, and that was the thing I needed to hold on to. But I think I knew earlier than I admitted that Judith's words had been landing somewhere deep in Tessa, accumulating quietly, slowly, rearranging the way she saw what she had and what she deserved. The company restructuring did not create the problem. It just removed the last thing that had been keeping it beneath the surface. My division was eliminated in the second quarter. 15 years of performance reviews, regional expansions, and team turnarounds ended with an HR meeting and a severance package that would cover about 8 months of expenses if I was careful. I told Tessa that evening over dinner. She set down her fork and asked how long I had known. When I told her I had found out that afternoon, she said very little, and the very little she said was not unkind. But something shifted at the table that night. I could see it in the way she looked at me, not with contempt yet, but with the early stages of recalculation. I picked up consulting work. Small engagements, short-term contracts, the kind of work that pays enough to keep moving, but not enough to feel like traction. I sent out resumes twice a week. I made calls. I did everything a reasonable person could be expected to do in that situation, and none of it was enough to close the distance that had opened between Tessa and me. The questions changed. Early in our marriage, when either of us had a hard day, the first thing the other asked was whether the person was all right. By month 3 after the layoff, Tessa had stopped asking if I was all right. She asked when things were going to change. She asked how long the consulting work was expected to last. She asked once whether I had considered that some of my former colleagues were already in new positions, as if that were a fact I might have overlooked. Judith visited more frequently that spring. She and Tessa would sit in the kitchen with coffee after I had left the room, and I would hear the low current of their voices without catching the specific words. I did not need to catch them. I had heard enough of those conversations over 17 years to know their shape. By May, I had the distinct feeling that decisions were being made in that kitchen that I was not part of. I told myself I was being paranoid. I focused on the next interview, the next submission, the next small contract. I kept going because that was what I knew how to do. The night Tessa told me to leave, I came home from that failed interview to find my suitcase in the front hallway. Not packed, carelessly packed with a thoroughness that told me this had been prepared before I left that morning. Tessa was standing in the living room. Judith was behind her near the hallway arch holding a cup of tea with both hands, watching me with the calm of someone attending a procedure they had already scheduled and confirmed. There was no screaming. There was no dramatic confrontation I could have pushed back against or redirected. Tessa spoke in the even, measured tone she used when she had made up her mind completely, and there was nothing left to negotiate. She told me the marriage was over. She said she had already spoken with a lawyer that the house was predominantly in her name due to the refinancing we had done 2 years earlier, and that the process would be straightforward. Judith set down her cup and said with perfect composure that I should have enough self-respect to leave without making things difficult. I looked at Tessa for a long moment. I had known this woman since she was 31 years old. I had watched her build her practice from almost nothing, had believed in her when she was staying up past midnight redesigning her entire approach after losing 3 clients in 1 quarter. I had stood beside her at her father's funeral and held her up when her legs gave out at the graveside. I thought about all of that in the space of a few seconds, and then I asked her the only question that felt worth asking, whether this was truly what she wanted. She said yes without any visible hesitation. And that was when I understood that whatever conversation I was standing in, it had already been finished before I walked through the door. I picked up the suitcase and left. I had no plan. I had less than $900 in my personal account. My car was paid off, which was the only clean financial fact in my life at that moment. I sat in the driveway for longer than I should have, long enough that the porch light went off on its automatic timer, and then I drove. I ended up on the east side in the neighborhood where Wesley Boone ran his repair shop. I had not called ahead. I did not entirely know why I had driven there rather than somewhere else. Wesley and I had grown up in the same part of Raleigh, had stayed loosely in each other's lives through the kind of low-maintenance friendship that survives without requiring much. He was not wealthy. He was not in a position to solve any of my problems. But when he opened the side door of the garage and found me standing on the step with a suitcase, he did not ask what had happened or what I needed or how long I was planning to stay. He just looked at me for a moment and said I needed a roof and he had one. The room above the garage at Boone Motor Works was small, a cot, a bathroom with a shower that took 2 full minutes to warm up a single window that faced the back alley. It was the kind of space that a person only notices is adequate when they are desperate enough to understand what adequate actually means. Wesley left a spare key on the workbench without discussion. He did not check in on me more than I wanted. He treated me with the same matter-of-fact decency he would have extended to anyone he had known his entire life, which meant he left me alone when I needed space and showed up with 2 cups of coffee when he sensed I had been alone too long. He did not ask about the divorce proceedings. He did not ask about money. He behaved as though my presence above his garage was the most ordinary arrangement in the world. 3 weeks passed. I kept sending applications. I kept making calls. I told myself the consulting would stabilize, that something full-time would come through, that the situation was temporary. The call from Howard Bellamy came on a Tuesday morning while I was at the workbench in the garage helping Wesley sort through a parts delivery he had not had time to catalog. Howard identified himself as an estate attorney and asked whether I was Calvin Reddick. When I said yes, he asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. He explained briefly that he had been working through the formal verification process required before he could make contact confirming identity, establishing the legal standing of the beneficiary designation, ensuring the documentation was airtight before any disclosure. He gave me an address in Midtown and said he would explain everything in person. I drove to that office assuming it was something minor, a small policy, some administrative matter connected to an older relative I had largely lost track of. I was not prepared for what was waiting on the 14th floor. Beatrice Reddick was my father's aunt. She had never married, had no children, and had lived for as long as I could remember in a modest house on the outskirts of Greensboro. She was not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She did not hug easily or say the things people say to make other people feel appreciated. But she paid attention, and I had always sensed that her attention was its own form of regard. When I was younger, I had visited her regularly during a period when she was managing a series of health complications that made ordinary tasks difficult. I would drive out on weekends to bring groceries, handle yard work, sit with her through long afternoons when she did not want company exactly, but did not want to be alone either. I had not done it because I expected anything. I had done it because it seemed like the right thing to do for someone who did not have many other people to call on. Howard Bellamy was a composed man in his early 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades delivering news that required careful handling. He waited until I was seated, offered water that I declined, and then placed a folder on the desk between us. He told me Beatrice had passed away several weeks earlier, around the same time Tessa had put my suitcase in the hallway. I realized a coincidence, so precisely timed it felt almost designed. He told me she had prepared a detailed estate plan, and that I was named as the primary beneficiary. He said the phrase approximately $25 million in the same measured tone he had used to offer the water, and my brain registered the words without absorbing their meaning for what felt like a very long time. He let the silence sit without filling it, which was the right instinct. When I finally asked whether there had been some mistake, he opened the folder and showed me the documentation. Beatrice had signed the most recent amendment to the trust less than 18 months ago. There was no ambiguity. The estate included cash holdings, an investment portfolio, and a significant stake in Redwood Freight Properties, an industrial warehousing and logistics operation spread across multiple states that Beatrice had been quietly building for decades while living in a house that gave no indication of what she had accumulated. Howard then read a portion of the letter Beatrice had written to accompany the estate documents. She did not use flowery language. She wrote the way she had always spoken, directly, without decoration. She said that over many years, various people in her life had been attentive to her when they sensed there was something to be attentive to, and had disappeared when there was not. She wrote that I had visited her during a long and difficult period without ever once asking what she intended to do with her assets. She said she had found that unusual. She said she had remembered it. That was essentially all she wrote by way of explanation. It was enough. Howard gave me a moment and then told me something I needed to hear more practically. The estate transfer was not yet complete. The full transfer of assets would take several months to finalize, and more immediately he had learned I was in the middle of divorce proceedings. He explained that an inheritance received after the date of legal separation was generally treated as separate property under North Carolina law, but that if I used the funds carelessly or mixed them with marital assets in ways that complicated the record, Tessa's legal team could create problems that would take significant time and money to resolve. He said I needed to be careful. He said I needed to be quiet. He asked whether I wanted a referral to a financial advisor who specialized in estate transitions and could help me move through the next several months without letting emotion drive the decisions. I said yes. I drove back to the garage that evening and sat in the room above the shop for a long time without turning on the light. Wesley was still working downstairs. I could hear the impact wrench running, the occasional sound of something heavy being moved across the concrete floor. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary evening in a life that had not changed at all. Mine had changed completely, and no one in the world knew it yet. The thought I kept returning to was simpler and more uncomfortable than anything involving money or law or inheritance. Beatrice had watched me for years, had made a private decision about my character based on what she observed, and had kept that decision to herself until the end. She had trusted that the person she saw when she was at her lowest was the actual person, not a performance put on in the hope of something in return. And she had been right. I had never given a second thought to what she might own or leave behind. I had just shown up. Tessa had watched me for 17 years. And the moment the external indicators disappeared, the salary, the title, the monthly confirmation that I was producing something measurable, she had looked at me and concluded there was nothing left worth keeping. I had $25 million in assets that were about to become mine, and I had not yet figured out whether that changed a single thing that actually mattered. Howard Bellamy's referral came through 2 days after our meeting at his office. Her name was Selena Ward, and she ran a boutique wealth management practice out of a converted Victorian on the north side of Raleigh. She had handled estate transitions before she told me during our first meeting, including several involving divorces that were already in progress when the inheritance landed. She was not alarmed by my situation. She had seen worse. She laid out the operational rules first, because those were the easiest to communicate clearly. No major purchases. No new real estate, no vehicles, no visible change in lifestyle. No lending money to anyone regardless of the relationship. No mixing the inherited assets with any account that Tessa's legal team could argue had ever been jointly accessed. Everything needed to stay exactly as it appeared from the outside, a man living above his friend's garage, working through a difficult divorce with no significant resources to speak of. The financial architecture of the inheritance would be constructed quietly in the background, through instruments that left no surface trace, until the transfer was fully complete and the divorce was finalized. I understood the logic. I did not enjoy it. There was a particular frustration in sitting across from a woman who was explaining how to protect $25 million while I was still calculating whether I had enough in my account to cover an oil change. But I followed the rules because Howard had been clear about what was at stake if I did not, and because some part of me recognized that Selena was not giving me these restrictions out of excessive caution. She was giving them to me because she had watched other people in my position make expensive mistakes in the first 90 days. Then she asked me a question that had nothing to do with asset allocation or legal strategy, and it was the question that stayed with me long after everything else from that meeting had faded. She looked at me directly and asked whether I wanted to use the money to build something, or whether I wanted to use it to prove something to someone. She did not name Tessa. She did not need to. She said the answer to that question would determine everything she recommended going forward, and that she needed me to think about it honestly rather than quickly. I told her I did not have an answer yet. She said that was fine, and that she preferred honesty over speed. I drove back to the garage that afternoon and went upstairs without stopping to talk to Wesley, who was in the middle of a brake job and only looked up long enough to nod. I sat on the cot and stared at the ceiling and turned Selena's question over in my mind like a stone. I kept expecting to find something written on the underside of. I had spent the past several weeks functioning on the logic of immediate survival, send applications, manage expenses, keep moving. Now there was nothing immediate to survive. There was only the question of what I actually wanted, which turned out to be a much harder question than any of the practical ones I had been avoiding it with. The answer did not come that afternoon. It came in pieces over days in the spaces between other things. What I did not know was that while I was sitting with Selena's question, something had already shifted on the other side of the divorce proceedings. Tessa's attorney had sent over a formal request for asset disclosure, a standard step in the process, covering any financial changes that had occurred after our official date of separation. I had disclosed the inheritance through Howard as required. It was listed under my name under the estate designation with the full name of the trust. I had not hidden anything. There was no legal reason to. Tessa's attorney saw the name Reddick Estate in the documentation and flagged it for her client. Tessa began making inquiries. I learned this later not from Tessa directly, but from Howard, who had been contacted by her legal team requesting clarification on the nature and scope of the asset. Tessa had apparently started by assuming it was something small, a house in another county perhaps, or some modest savings account that had been overlooked. She had her attorney dig further. Her attorney found references to Redwood freight properties in the trust documentation. It took less than 48 hours for her to understand the approximate scale of what she was looking at. The first message she sent me did not mention money. It did not mention the estate, the trust Beatrice, or the disclosure her attorney had just received. It simply said she had been thinking about the two of them, about their marriage, about whether they had made decisions too quickly. I read it twice. 3 weeks earlier in the living room of the house she had told me was hers. She had looked at me with the clarity of someone who had already concluded a conversation they had not yet started out loud. There had been no uncertainty in her face that night. There had been no hesitation when I asked whether this was really what she wanted. She had said yes with the ease of a person confirming a reservation. She came to the garage on a Saturday morning. Wesley was working. The bay doors were open and the sound of an engine running a diagnostic test filled the space. She walked around to the side entrance and called up the stairs, and I came down because I did not think refusing to see her would accomplish anything that actually mattered. We stood near the back of the garage away from where Wesley was working, and she spoke with an openness I had not seen from her in years. She said she had let outside pressure distort her perspective. She said she had acted from fear rather than reason. She said 17 years deserved more than the way things had ended, and that if I was willing, she thought there was still something worth returning to. I listened to all of it. When she finished, I asked her one question. I asked whether she would be standing in that garage if Beatrice had left me nothing. She did not answer immediately. She looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, something between genuine emotion and the awareness that she had walked into a question she had not prepared for. She did not answer it. She said that was not a fair way to frame the conversation. I told her it was the only frame that mattered to me. She left without resolving anything, and I went back upstairs. Tessa's approach changed in the weeks that followed. When she recognized that sentiment was not going to move me, she shifted strategies in a way that removed whatever residual ambiguity I had been trying to extend her. Her attorney contacted Howard with a series of arguments structured around the claim that after 17 years of marriage, Tessa had a reasonable basis to expect participation in assets that had been shaped, however indirectly, by the stability of the marital relationship. The argument was that by supporting the household during the years when I had maintained contact with Beatrice, Tessa had contributed to the conditions that made me the kind of person Beatrice would trust and remember. It was a creative legal theory. It was also, as Howard put it, with characteristic understatement, unlikely to find traction given the explicit language of Beatrice's trust documents. I brought the situation to Selena at our next meeting. She reviewed the summary Howard had prepared and set it down without visible reaction. Then she said something I had not expected. She said the legal position was clear. Tessa had no viable claim on the inheritance under the circumstances as documented. But she also said something more careful, that she noticed I had not yet answered the question she had asked at our first meeting, and that she thought my answer was becoming clearer whether I had articulated it or not. She said the fact that I had not moved to retaliate, had not made any impulsive purchase, had not tried to weaponize the money told her something important about what I actually intended. She said we could work with that. Then Howard called on a Wednesday afternoon with information that removed the last of my uncertainty about what the story had actually been. During the discovery process in the divorce proceedings, Tessa's own communications had become part of the documentary record. Her attorney had apparently not anticipated that a particular chain of emails would surface in the way it did. Howard read me the relevant details carefully without editorializing. Tessa had first made contact with a divorce attorney, not after my layoff, not during the months of reduced income, but several months before my position was eliminated during a period when I had still been employed full-time, still bringing home a salary that covered our share of the mortgage, still representing on paper. Everything she had told me in the garage, she had decided was no longer enough. In the email correspondence with Judith, she had written that she was waiting for the right financial moment. That phrase, the right financial moment, meant she had been watching for a set of conditions that would make the exit cleanest for her. My layoff had not caused the decision. It had satisfied the conditions. The reduced income had given her legal and social cover for a conclusion she had already reached privately, and she had been patient enough to wait for it to arrive. There was also an implication in one of the later emails, less explicit but clear enough to Howard's trained eye, that she had intended to use my diminished financial position as leverage that a man without resources and without immediate prospects would be easier to maneuver into a settlement that favored her terms before he had time to stabilize and think clearly. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after Howard finished. I thought about the night she told me to leave the packed suitcase, the measured tone Judith's cup of tea, the porch light going off on its timer. I had believed at some level that I had not fully examined until that moment that the marriage had failed because I had failed, that losing the job had been the rupture, and that everything that followed was the consequence of that rupture. It was a painful story, but it was a story with a kind of logic I could accept because it gave the 17 years a coherence they deserved. The email chain dismantled that entirely. The 17 years had not ended because I lost a job. They had ended because Tessa had already ended them in her own mind, long before any external fact gave her a reason to, and had then waited for the world to catch up with a decision she had already made. And the idea that she had intended to use my lowest point as a negotiating advantage, that she had factored my vulnerability into her exit strategy, was the detail I had the most difficulty sitting with because it meant that the person I had been trying to protect all those years had been looking at my struggling and calculating rather than feeling. $25 million does not fix that. I want to be direct about that because there is a version of this story where the inheritance becomes the answer to everything, where the money arrives and suddenly all the pain has a resolution built into it. That is not what happened. What happened was that I learned I was about to be significantly wealthy at the same moment I learned the most important relationship of my adult life had been operating on terms I had not known I was agreeing to. One fact did not cancel out the other. They existed at the same time in the same room, and the money made the second fact louder rather than quieter because it confirmed exactly what Tessa had valued and exactly what she had been willing to do to protect that value. I called Howard back that evening and asked him a question I already knew he could not answer. I asked what good $25 million was if its main function was to show me that 17 years had meant nothing. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful honesty I had come to expect from him, that he did not have an answer to that question and that it was probably not a question with a legal answer anyway. He told me to get some sleep. He said we had work to do in the morning and that the work was real and manageable, and that I should try to stay close to the things that were real and manageable for the time being. I went to the window and looked out at the alley behind the garage. A street light was on at the far end. The building was quiet in a way that felt different from the silence of the North Briar Estates house on a still evening. Smaller, cleaner, less loaded with the weight of what was supposed to be there and was not. I had not answered Selena's question yet, not fully. But I was beginning to understand that the answer was not going to come from thinking about Tessa at all. It was going to have to come from somewhere else entirely. The call from Selena came on a Friday morning 4 days after Howard had read me the contents of Tessa's email chain. I had spent those 4 days in a kind of functional numbness getting up, making coffee on the small 2-burner unit Wesley had set up in the back corner of the room, helping downstairs when there was work to be done, going through the motions of a routine that kept me from sitting still long enough to let everything I had learned settle into its full weight. I was not avoiding the grief exactly. I was just not ready to face it directly, and so I moved around the edges of it the way you move around a room you know is dark without turning on the light. Selena did not open with pleasantries. She said she had spoken with Howard, that she was aware of what the discovery process had surfaced, and that she wanted to say something before the formal meetings resumed. Then she said the thing I needed to hear in the direct way she had of saying things that mattered. She told me I had already answered her question. She said that when I had called Howard on that Wednesday evening and asked what good $25 million was if it only showed me that 17 years had meant nothing. I had told her exactly what I was not trying to do with the money. That was the answer she had been waiting for, and we could now build a real plan around it. She said it was time to act according to what I actually believed, rather than what I had been waiting for permission to believe. I did not say much in response. But something in the way she framed it, not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as a practical observation about what came next, reached a place that the previous 4 days of careful numbness had not. I was not going to use the inheritance to reconstruct something that had already been over before I walked out of that house. I was not going to spend whatever came next trying to prove to people who had decided I had no value that they were wrong about the number. The money was real and the work ahead was real, and the only question worth answering now was what I actually intended to build. The formal mediation session was scheduled for the following week at the offices of a neutral third party in downtown Raleigh. Howard had prepared the documentation. Selena had ensured the inheritance records were properly categorized as separate property. Tessa's attorney had filed the arguments they intended to make, and Howard had reviewed them carefully and concluded that none of them would survive scrutiny, given the explicit language of Beatrice's trust. The meeting was procedurally necessary, but in legal terms largely already decided. What was not decided was what I needed to say, and whether saying it would matter, and why I felt despite everything that it did. I arrived before Tessa. The conference room was neutral in the way those spaces always are, long table chairs with padded backs, a window that looked out over a parking structure. Howard was already seated on my side of the table. Tessa came in with her attorney about 10 minutes later, and Judith was not with her, which I had not expected. Tessa looked composed in the way she always looked composed, clothes precise, posture correct. But there was something underneath the composure that had not been there in the previous years I had known her. A kind of tightness. The look of someone who has been managing a situation they did not anticipate and has not yet decided whether to acknowledge that. Tessa's attorney opened with the expected language about seeking an equitable resolution and acknowledging the length and nature of the marriage. He made a brief reference to the estate assets and Tessa's position, which Howard answered with equal brevity and considerably more precision. I let the legal exchange run its course. When it reached a natural break, Tessa looked at me directly for the first time since she had walked in and said she wanted to speak plainly if that was acceptable. Her attorney gave a small nod. Howard looked at me. I said it was fine. She said she had made a mistake. She said she had allowed outside pressure to accelerate a decision that she had been uncertain about for longer than she had admitted to anyone, including herself. She said she had told herself that the problems in the marriage were practical, that they were about the money and the position and the future, and that framing had made it easier to act the way she had acted on the night she put the suitcase by the door. She said she understood now that the framing had been convenient rather than honest, and that she was sorry for the way things had ended. I listened to her say all of it. When she finished, I reached into the folder Howard had brought and placed 2 documents on the table between us. The first was a printed summary of the relevant portions of her email correspondence. The messages to Judith, the references to timing the phrase about waiting for the right financial moment. The second was the letter Beatrice had written to accompany the estate documents. I did not tell Tessa which was which. I let her read them both. The room was quiet while she read. Her attorney leaned slightly to look at the documents, and I watched Tessa's expression move through several things in the space of a minute. Recognition. Something that might have been shame, and then a kind of stillness that was different from her usual composure. When she set the papers down, I spoke for the first time since the mediation had begun. I told her that one woman had known me when I had nothing, had watched me show up without agenda or expectation, and had remembered that for decades. I told her that another woman had lived with me for 17 years and had reached for a lawyer before my desk was even cleared. I said it without bitterness because by that point the bitterness had mostly burned itself out, replaced by something flatter and more final. I was not performing dignity. I was just telling the truth about what the 2 documents between us represented. Tessa said she had made a mistake again, more quietly this time. I agreed with her. I told her the mistake was not that she had kicked out a man who turned out to be worth $25 million. The mistake was that she had believed a man without money was worth nothing at all, that the math of his value began and ended with what he was producing in any given quarter, that 17 years of showing up could be renegotiated the moment the external numbers changed. I told her the inheritance had not created that problem. It had just made it impossible to look away from. Tessa's attorney suggested they take a short break, and when they came back, the tone of the meeting had changed. The arguments about marital contribution and estate access were quietly withdrawn. What remained was the mechanical work of dividing what the law recognized as divisible. The house, the accounts that had been jointly managed, the assets that fell within the agreed terms of separation. Howard had prepared for this. It moved with the efficiency of something that had been properly anticipated. I signed the divorce agreement that afternoon. I did not attempt to take more than what was reasonable. Tessa retained the house at Northbriar Estates, which was structured in her favor and which I no longer had any interest in contesting. She kept the accounts and assets that fell within the marital estate, as defined by the terms and the applicable law. I kept the inheritance fully categorized as separate property, untouched by the proceedings. The whole thing was finished in less time than I expected. 17 years of a shared life reduced to a set of signatures on documents that Howard would file the following morning. I drove back to the garage without stopping anywhere. I sat in the car in the alley behind the shop for a while, not because I was broken by what had just happened, but because I needed a moment between the place I had been and wherever I was going next. The grief was still there. It did not disappear because the paperwork was done, but it had taken on a different quality. It was no longer the grief of something still in question. It was the grief of something settled, which is its own kind of weight, but a more bearable one. Wesley was replacing a fuel pump when I came into the garage. He looked up and read something in my face that made him set down the wrench. He asked if it was done. I told him it was. He said he was sorry and that he meant it, and then he picked up the wrench again because that was what Wesley did. He acknowledged things fully and then let them be what they were without prolonging them unnecessarily. A week later, I asked him to sit down with me in the small office at the back of the shop, the one with the metal desk and the corkboard covered in parts invoices and the old calendar he had never taken down from the previous year. I told him I had something to discuss and that I needed him to hear me out before he said anything. He folded his arms and waited. I told him about the inheritance, the full amount, Beatrice Redwood freight properties, all of it. I watched his face while I spoke. He did not react with the excitement or the disbelief I might have expected. He sat with the information for a moment the way Wesley always sat with information, letting it settle before he responded to it. Then he asked me one question. He wanted to know whether what I was about to propose was going to be fair to me. Not whether it was generous, not whether he deserved it, not what the numbers looked like, whether it was fair to me. I told him I had prepared a partnership agreement with Selena's help, that it was structured as a genuine business investment with equity terms that reflected Boone Motor Works' actual value and growth potential, and that I had had Howard review it independently to make sure it was clean. Wesley asked if he could read it before he signed anything, which was the right question. I gave him the folder. He read it slowly, page by page, in the way he read anything mechanical, systematically, without rushing. When he looked up, he said, "It looked fair." Not just to him, he said it looked fair all around. We shook hands over the metal desk with the parts invoices on the board above it, and that handshake meant more to me than anything that had happened in the conference room downtown, because it was built on a foundation that had never required either of us to calculate what the other one was worth. The work that followed was not dramatic. Selena and I spent several months working through the Redwood Freight Properties holdings, understanding the existing structure, identifying where Beatrice's careful management had created genuine value, deciding how to move forward in ways that honored what she had built without trying to expand it faster than the underlying business could sustain. Selena's question whether I was building or proving turned out to be a useful compass throughout. When I felt pulled toward a choice that was more about optics than substance, I went back to it. Every time the answer became a little clearer. I found a house in the suburbs north of Raleigh, a 4-bedroom with a yard that needed attention and a back deck that needed replacing. It was not a statement. It was a house. I moved in over a weekend with rented boxes and Wesley's truck, and Wesley helped me carry furniture up the stairs and complained about the weight of the bookshelf in the way that old friends complain about things loudly, affectionately, without any real grievance. We sat on the back deck in the late afternoon and talked about the Boone Motorworks expansion and the right timing for opening a second location. It was an ordinary conversation. It felt like the right kind of ordinary. I saw Tessa once more several months after the divorce was finalized. It was coincidental a street near the farmer's market on a Saturday morning. She looked well. She had moved out of North Briar Estates, which I had not known, and she mentioned the name of a neighborhood I recognized as smaller and quieter than where we had lived together. We exchanged the brief pleasantries of two people who share a significant history and have come to a workable peace with it. And then she said the thing she had apparently wanted to say since the mediation. She said that if she had known about the inheritance, none of it would have happened. She said it without self-pity and without blame, just as an observation she had been turning over and wanted to set down somewhere out loud. I looked at her for a moment on that sidewalk with the noise of the market behind us and the October light flat and clear over the street. Then I told her that was exactly why it had to happen. She understood what I meant. I could see it in the way her expression shifted. Not hurt exactly, but recognition. Because if she needed to know I had $25 million to decide I was worth keeping, then the marriage she would have preserved was not the marriage I needed to be in. The inheritance had not ended anything that was healthy. It had exposed something that was already gone and done it quickly enough that I could not spend another 17 years telling myself otherwise. She nodded once and said to take care of myself. I told her the same. We went our separate directions down the sidewalk, and I did not look back. Not from coldness, but from the clean and settled knowledge that there was nothing behind me that required a second look. What Beatrice left me was not just money. She left me evidence of a way of moving through the world that she had watched me practice without my awareness, showing up, without expectation, doing the work, without keeping a ledger, treating people as though their value was not a function of what they could produce in return. She had watched me do that for her during her difficult years, and she had believed it was genuine because I had not made it easy to see any other motive. She had been right. The money was real and the money mattered, and I did not pretend otherwise. But the money was only the outer layer of what had happened. The deeper thing was what it had revealed about Tessa, about Wesley, about the 17 years I had spent in a story I did not fully understand while I was living it. I was worth something before the inheritance. I was worth something during the years when Tessa had stopped believing it. I had been worth something on the night I walked out of that house with less than $900 and drove to a friend's garage because there was nowhere else to go, and he was the kind of person who opened the door. That was not something $25 million created. It was something $25 million finally made impossible to argue against, and only for the people who had needed the number to see it in the first place. Pay attention to the people who treat you well when they have every reason to believe you have nothing left to offer. That is usually the clearest picture you will ever get of who someone actually is. And if you have ever had someone in your corner during your worst stretch, someone who showed up without a calculation behind it, hold on to that. It is rarer than money and it matters more. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you never miss the next one. New stories go up every week and each one is built around the same idea that who you are when no one is watching is the most important thing about you.